Welcome back to what will be part 3 of Parking Lot. Parking Lot is a project that we're using to practice object arrays. In part 1, we made the parking space object that represents a single parking spot. A parking spot has some type of identifier, right? In our particular case, we're using letters and numbers to identify effectively the row in space. And then a parking space could be accessible, as indicated by these parentheses, the spot that is for people with disabilities. If it's not a particular accessible spot, it's just using brackets to mark that. And then the actual space indicates that that parking space is empty, it is available. However, we can end up occupying a space, and we'll use an X to mark off which spaces are occupied. In part 2 of that, we actually came through and made the constructor, and this is what our parking lot looks like currently. Now, long term, I want it to look something like this. That's what we're going to do in part 3, is that we're going to write the toString that makes it look like this. And I'm going to give you the same disclaimer I gave with the constructor. This is a finished project. I want to give you the same disclaimer I gave you with the constructor. If you don't quite get this part of it, that's okay. If I was giving this as a project, I would probably give the constructor and or the toString to you. Or just say, here you go, here it is, it's completed. If you got this on an FRQ, they would say, just assume it works like this, right? And then the focus is going to be what we'll see in part 4, those individual methods where we're just looping through our object array and kind of looking for information, that sort of thing. That is where the true understanding is going to come from. That is where our best practice is going to come from. That being said, I want a toString. I need a toString. We're going to make one. I'm in my parking lot project right now. All my toString is doing is just using arrays.toString. Arrays is a utility class, something that exists inside of Java. You get it whenever you download the Java JDK. Right? Up here is the import for that. And it contains a lot of utility methods, right? All these methods are static. You'll notice that I do not create an arrays object. I'm referencing the arrays class because ultimately this method, toString, is static inside of arrays. And what it does is it kind of creates what you see here. It goes through this particular case, it loops through the object array and calls the toString on each of the objects. So what you're seeing here, these little individual parking spaces, that's thanks to our parking space toString. We wrote this in part 1, and it effectively goes with a single parking space. But I have a whole parking lot consisting of multiple parking spaces. We're going to make the toString. Okay. Now, a couple of things to kind of note here. Even though we have a 1D array, we're ultimately displaying this kind of in like a 2D fashion. We'll talk more about 2D arrays later, but think like a table or a grid. That's ultimately what we got going on here. In order to do this, I'm going to need nested loops. Right? Let's make this parking lot a little bit smaller so we can kind of talk. Right? Numlock was not on. Let's narrow this back down to like 20 spaces over 4 rows. Okay. If I was looking at our current toString, and maybe, very close. Right now, everything is displayed in a 1D array. So ultimately, here's what I want to do. I want to basically get this first row and display it like a row. One thing to keep in mind, however, is that I'm going to have to basically loop through this section, getting the labels, and then displaying those, printing those off, adding them to my toString. I then need to loop back through that section and get the indicators telling me if it's an accessible spot or not. And then I'm going to kind of print that off. And that is effectively the first row. I then am going to move to the next section. So let's think about that. For every row, I'm going to get the labels, and then I'm going to get the indicators telling me if it's accessible or not. And then I'll move on to the next row. I'm going to do that for each row. So that's nested loops. There's just no way around that. I am back in my parking lot class. I'm going to go down to the toString. Let's just nix what we got here. We're going to start out with an empty string. And what I want to do is kind of keep track of my numbers of rows. So I'm going to create row. Row is effectively 0. I haven't processed any rows is kind of my thought about it. Now, something of note, we saved rows into our instance variable, and that was very important. We used rows in order to figure out how many rows are going to be in my parking lot, how to kind of space those things out, how to correctly label them. But I went ahead and saved it into an instance variable because I knew I was going to need it down here later on. Simply put, while row is less than rows. Right? We're kind of fashioning together. You could use a for loop maybe to accomplish this. I kind of like the while loop. Whatever. We're going to loop through for each row. What I want to do on this initial row is effectively loop through this section. Okay, in order for me to do that, notice that each row has the same amount of spaces. I need to know how many spaces are there per row. That doesn't change with each row, so it's a calculation that we can perform right up front. We've actually done it before. It's this. Right? I need to know spaces per row. I just take my total number of spaces and then divide it by my number of rows. Now, here's the problem. This is red. Spaces. How do I know how many spaces? Well, spaces up here in my constructor was used to determine the length of the object array. But it only exists in the constructor, meaning that once this constructor ends here on line 36, spaces goes away. That variable doesn't exist here. However, I don't really need it anymore because the way that I can find it is just by going into my parking lot array and getting the length, right? I used spaces here to set the length of my array. That array is ultimately saved into the instance variable, which means that if I want to know how many total spaces I have, all I got to do is go into that array and ask, how long is it? And that's going to be my spaces per row. Okay, so we're going to be on our first row, and I want to loop that. All right, we'll continue to use this as an example. So let's just say that we made a parking lot with 20 total spaces and 4 rows, which is what we have here. If I do that, my spaces per row is going to be 5. Okay, I'm on this first row. Effectively, I want to do 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Effectively, I'm going to create a loop here. I'll use the 4i shortcut. And we want, this is going to be index 0, right? And I'm going to loop up through position 5. But what I have here, spaces per row, that has a value of 5. So I'm going to use that. Okay, this is going to be kind of the gist. Let's loop through these 5 spots, grab the label, right? Because ultimately, we're going to display the label on its own little row. So here we go. Here's the object array part of this. I'm looping through. I'm only going to go from 0 to 5 in this particular case. And so I'm going to pull out the label. It needs to come from the object that's in the array. Okay, so I'm pulling from my object array at the current index. Lot is a parking space array. Lot at I is a single parking space. So what I have highlighted, it is a parking space. What I want out of that is the label. Okay, so I'm going to take lot at I dot get label. That is my label. That's going to be A01. I want to add that to my return string. Right? I want to add that and then maybe follow it up with a space. So I'm going to take this. We're going to say that our return string is going to become what it currently is plus the current label. Okay, and a lot of you know that you could do plus equals here as a shorthand assignment operator to get that going. And I'm going to go ahead and tack on the space. And in theory, that should be our labels. Right? I'm actually going to go ahead and maybe try out what I got. Right now, this method is mad at me. You see a little red squiggly boy. That's because we're saying that we're going to return a string. I'm trying to form it, but I have not returned it. I'm going to return it here at the very end. Let's try this out. I'm going to flip back to my driver. I've already created my parking lot, and we're going to try to print it. Beforehand, that was giving me this stuff. But now we're switching it up a little bit. Now it should just be the labels. Okay, so there's the first 5 labels, and I'm printing the first 5 labels again, but I'm doing it 4 times because we're ultimately doing 4 rows. We'll kind of go back through that and figure out what's going on, but I'm getting the labels. I'm getting the first 5 labels. That's important. Okay, after I do the labels, I'm ultimately going to go down, right? Make a new kind of row here on my to string. The way that we ultimately do that is that I'm going to take my return string and I'm just going to add the new line character. I'm saying it is a character because I could put it in single quotes signifying that it is a character. That's what it is. It's the enter key, basically. Okay, doesn't matter which one you use, single quotes, double quotes, but we'll add a new line, which means that we're now down here. If I was to run this right now, all we're really handling is the labels, but every time I process a row, we're going to add a new line character, and so we're getting to a new row with that. Okay, while I'm on the current row, so after I've gotten the labels, after I've made my new line, what I want to do is get the indicators telling me if the spot is accessible or not. So I'm going to loop back through this section, right? The exact same section that I just did. Let's plug in our for I. I starts at 0 as long as I is less than spaces per row. We're going to play with those numbers. That's actually kind of one of the harder parts of this. What I'm going to do is loop back through that section. Right? I need to go back through the original parking spots. I've already processed the labels. I need to go back through, figure out, is this spot accessible or not? If it's accessible, we're going to do that. I'm also going to need to figure out, is it occupied or not, right? We're not showing the occupancy here, but we're going to write this method very soon where we could say that maybe AO2 is now occupied. Oh, I should probably print it off so we can see that change. Right, AO2 is now occupied. So not only when we're looping back through should we get the indicators indicating if it's accessible or not, we should also figure out is it occupied or not and include our X. Okay, so I'm looping through that exact same section. I'm going to take my array. I'm going to pull out the current parking space. This is a parking space array. This is a parking space. I've got the parking space. I want to know, is it accessible? If that spot is accessible, I want to add the opening parenthesis. Right, so I'm going to take my return string and I'm going to add a parenthesis. Right? This is a parking space array. This is a parking space. I'm going to go in that parking space and figure out, is it accessible, true or false? If it's true, it's an accessible spot, so I want a parenthesis. If this is false, we'll hit this else where we tack on an opening bracket. Okay, so I'm figuring out the opening. Is it a parenthesis? Is it a bracket? I now need to figure out, is the spot occupied? Exact same spot, right? If lotted I is occupied. If it's occupied, I'm going to tack on an X. Otherwise, I'm going to tack on an empty space. Lastly, I need to handle the closing syntax here. It's the exact same thing, except we're going to flip the symbol. And that should effectively work. For each of the rows, I'm going to go through and get the labels. I'm going to add those to my return string. I'm going to make a new line, and we're going to loop back through that exact same section to get the indicators and the occupancy. Let's take a look at what we got. A little something like this, right? So here's my labels. Here's my occupancy. That looks pretty good. We're missing a space in between our things there. And after we handle the row effectively, we need to add a new line character. So what I'm going to do is when we determine is it accessible or not, I'm going to add a parenthesis space. I'm going to add a bracket space. So that should help our stuff align a little bit better. That's looking pretty good. And then right before we finish off the row, I need to add a new line character. And so we'll kind of repeat what we did earlier on line 54. Sweet. This is looking good, other than we're doing the same section of 5 characters. So I got to come up with a start and a stop that's more dynamic, right? I need a start and a stop that is going to kind of scale up. Well, once I finish the first 5, I basically want to start on 5. Right? What actually has a value of 5? Well, my spaces per row. So that should be an indicator, right? I'm going to go 0 through 5, stopping at 5. I'm going to do 5 through 9, stopping at 10. I'm going to do 10 through, 14, stopping at 15, and then I'm going to do 15 through 19. So we're going up in increments of 5. Luckily for me, I have spaces per row, which has a value of 5. So what I want to do is my starting point is not just 0. It is spaces per row times 0. But if I just do 0 every single time, we're going to get the same value, right? So I'm going to multiply it by my row. Okay, I'm doing that for effectively both parts, right? Initially, row is 0. Initially, spaces per row is 5. Spaces per row is not going to change, by the way, not when we call this method. It will change with different parking lot objects. So we're going to take our row, which is 0, multiply it by 5. We're going to get 0. So the very first row, I'm going to start at index 0. At the very end, we're going to end up incrementing row, making it 1. So the next time that we're on the next row, we're going to do 5 times 1, which means we're starting at index 5. Okay, so let's try this out. And you're going to notice we only get the first row. What happened here? Well, we did spaces per row, which was 5, times our initial value, which is 0. We got 0. We save that in. It looks pretty good. We're going to ask, is 0 less than 5? Yeah, so we go through, we do the entire first row. Row increases. On the next iteration, we got spaces per row, which is 5, times row, which is 1. That's 5. I'm going to ask, is 5 less than 5? No. That's the reason why we're not doing any of the other future rows. So what needs to happen here is that we got to scale up our endpoint as well, right? If you think back to our row, our original endpoint was effectively 5, right? And I could get this to kind of progress along with my row by multiplying. But think about this for a moment. My initial row is 0, which means that this value is going to be 0. I need it to be 5. What I really need it to be is just row plus 1. I'm going to grab that formula. I'm going to plug it in for the other for loop. Let's try this. And there you have it. I'm going to try a couple of different values, but the key here is to take our start and stop point and kind of just shift them along, scaling them with our row. Of note, these braces, they are optional. I think it starts to look a little bit messy whenever you take them off. I actually really like them here, even though there's only one statement. They're not optional in this one because there's ultimately 3 if statements and you need all 3. But let's play with some numbers to make sure our 2-string is looking good. All right, I'm going to up this to like 100 spaces spread out over 4 rows. Looks pretty good. I'm going to maybe spread out those 100 spaces over 10 rows. And that's looking pretty good. So this is going to wrap up our 2-string. It's going to wrap up this video. I will see you in part 4 where we'll handle the rest of the methods.